The first thing I noticed was the sound, not the belt itself. I already knew conveyor noise. I'd spent enough years around canneries, docks, and packaging lines to sort machine sounds by instinct. A healthy belt had a steady pull to it, a flat mechanical confidence. This one had that, but underneath it was something wet, a dragging correction like a hand smoothing bed sheets from underneath the mattress. The air tasted like pennies and brine, cold enough to tighten the inside of my nose. Every surface near the line was slick, even the yellow guardrail beside me. Fish scales clung to my gloves like translucent fingernails. The jam looked ordinary at first, silver bodies packed too tightly where the belt narrowed toward the cutters. Then one of them turned its head. I say head because that's what it had, but the eyes were wrong. It not missing, not damaged. They were there, glossy and dark, but set too deep and angled inward, as if whatever had arranged the thing had used the rest of the fish for reference and guessed at the face. Its mouth opened once, closed. Then the body gave a little twitch and shifted against the others, pressing itself into line. It was aligning itself. I reached in on reflex. I was there to keep the machinery moving. If something snagged the belt, you cleared it before you lost a motor. Over the loudspeaker, Nolan Vester's voice cracked through the plant. Do not remove anything that is correcting itself. My hand stopped 3 inches from the thing's skin. The malformed fish shuddered again, its spine flexed. One eye seemed to drag beneath the flesh. Then the belt lurched, the jam released, and the whole mass slid forward into the next section like nothing had happened. I stood there with my glove hanging over the line, tasting metal and salt, staring at the gap where it had been. And all I could think was this. Whoever wrote that rule had seen this before. That was maybe 2 hours into the shift. I need to go back to how I ended up there. I'd gone to Unalaska for 6 nights of contract maintenance and a rate high enough that I didn't ask many questions. That's the truth of it. I was an outside contractor, the kind plants called when they needed somebody who could walk in cold, learn a line fast and keep it running until they could hand the problem back to their own people. I worked freezer systems, belts, pumps, hydraulic feeders, washdown assemblies, whatever a coastal facility needed to survive a stretch of weather, labor shortage, or both. In Alaska, that usually meant both. The plant sat on Amaknak Island, low against the dark water, all corrugated walls and sodium lights, with the harbor behind it and the open cold beyond that. By the time I arrived, evening had already flattened into that strange northern half-dark where the sky still held color but the ground looked drained of it. The wind carried diesel, kelp, and old blood. Even before I stepped through the loading entrance, I could taste the metallic tang sitting under the salt, like the whole building had been rinsed in diluted rust and never fully dried. That detail seemed minor at the time. I've thought about it every day since. Inside, the grinding hum of machinery came up through the soles of my boots. Not loud exactly, constant, and it felt less like hearing something and more like standing too close to a transformer. Every wall sweated cold. The handrail at the intake ramp left my palm wet and greasy, though it had supposedly been sanitized less than an hour earlier. Darlene Ivik met me just past the locker room. She was shorter than I expected, broad through the shoulders, with the kind of economy in her movements that told me she'd spent years in places where hesitation cost money. Her hair was pinned back under a cap, her rubber apron already streaked dark. She didn't waste time with small talk. "You're Elias Rourke," I told her I was. "You keep the line moving. You don't freelance. You don't troubleshoot outside your assignment. You hear something strange, you call it in. You see something strange, and you leave it alone unless I tell you otherwise." Her voice had no drama in it, just routine. That made it easy to take as plant culture, not a warning. I gave her the answer supervisors like. As long as your paperwork matches your equipment. She stared at me for a second, then handed me a radio and a laminated badge with a temporary strip of reflective tape over my name. Read the posted rules in the break room before you touch anything. Every industrial site had rules posted somewhere. Usually they were insurance language pretending to be wisdom. Lift with your legs. Lock out before service. Report spills. So I nodded and went where she pointed. The break room smelled like burnt coffee, bleach, wet gloves, and microwave fish. The overhead light buzzed. A vending machine rattled against the far wall hard enough to make the plastic front tremble. Next to the time clock was a laminated sheet, cleaner than anything else in the room, bolted at all four corners as if somebody expected it to be torn down. There were 6 rules. Do not stop the conveyor belts unless instructed by a supervisor. If a specimen appears malformed, do not discard it. Continue processing. If the floor begins to vibrate without machinery active, leave the processing area immediately. Do not respond to voices coming from the drainage system. If you notice repetition in specimens, report it, but do not intervene. Never enter sub-level C during night shift operations. I read them twice. Then a third time. The first one was odd but not absurd. Plants hated unscheduled stoppages. And the second sounded like a quality control issue written by somebody who'd never actually worked quality control. The third and fourth were stupid enough to be a joke, except nobody had bothered to make them funny. The fifth was too specific. The sixth was the sort of thing you posted when you wanted to make sure everybody asked what sub-level C was. I remember putting my thumb against the lower edge of the laminate. Cold plastic. Tiny ridge where the sheet had been replaced more than once. When I looked up, Nolan Vester was standing in the radio alcove behind the break room window, half lit by indicator panels and the green blink of channel lights. He had a long, tired face and the expression of somebody listening to more than one thing at a time. You read them? He asked through the open service slot. Yeah. Good. That fourth one's new. He didn't smile. You'll hear a lot of things in a place like this. From the drains, from anywhere sound can travel. There was a little pause then, just long enough to feel deliberate. Then he said, "Don't answer unless you're sure who asked." That should have been the moment I took the whole thing more seriously. Instead, I filed it with the other plant superstitions I'd picked up over the years. Men who wouldn't whistle on freezer decks. Women who wouldn't wear red near crab tanks. Entire crews who treated one particular valve or corridor or boiler room door like it had moods. Industrial work grows its own folklore. You either mock it or work around it. I'd learned the second option was better for getting through a shift. Darlene took me onto the floor after that, and the processing area was a long, bright wound of stainless steel, belts, rollers, wash hoses, sorting tables, and drain channels. Fish moved through it in silver floods. The cutters snapped and hissed, water sprayed. The whole place smelled like opened flesh without ever crossing into rot. Fresh kill, sea salt, iron, everything slick, everything cold. The floor had enough texture to keep you upright, but it still felt treacherous, like walking across a tongue. My assignment was basic. Monitor belt speed on the primary line. Check for jams at the narrowing gate. Service the wash nozzles if pressure dropped. Keep an eye on one feeder motor that had been tripping thermal under load. Routine. That was the trap. Everything looked routine. Even the fish. At first, I made my first circuit and found nothing worse than a loose shroud over the chain return. Tightened it. Logged it. Radioed in. Darlene answered with a clipped acknowledgement. Nolan's channel stayed open in the background, a soft bed of static and call-outs from other sections of the plant. I never saw another crew face to face. Night shift was thin by design or by necessity, and most of the building beyond processing stayed dark. A little before midnight, I noticed the taste. Not in the air, in my mouth. I'd stepped into the wash corridor for a coffee and the metallic flavor was still there, stronger somehow, coating the back of my throat. I rinsed from a paper cup at the sink. It didn't leave. I checked for a nosebleed, nothing. When I spit, the water went clear. And that was when I started wondering if the smell of the place was getting into me. I should have left then. Contract work gave me that freedom. If a site felt wrong enough, you made an excuse, called your dispatcher, and ate the lost hours. But the line was running well, the pay was good, and whatever was off about the plant still had the shape of human weirdness, not danger. Then I saw the first malformed fish. It came down the belt among 100 others, silver flank, dark back, same size class, same species. Nothing dramatic, no split skin, no twisted body. It just had the wrong geometry. The left pectoral fin was set a little too high. The mouth sat half an inch off center. The gill plate overlapped in a way that made the whole head look assembled rather than grown. I hooked it out automatically, and before I could toss it into the discard tub, Darlene's voice cut across the line. "Put it back." I turned. "This one's wrong." "I know." "You want it separated for inspection?" "No." She took 2 steps toward me, not hurried, not angry. "Put it back and let it run." The fish in my glove felt colder than the others. Not fresher, just colder. The skin had a firm, resistant slickness, like touching something coated in weak glue. "Rule 2, she said. "That's for malformed specimens. That is a malformed specimen. That thing should not be in product." Her eyes stayed on mine. "It isn't in product yet." I should have pushed. On any sane line, I would have. Instead, I set it back onto the moving belt and watched it travel. That was escalation by inches. That's how this place worked. And it never gave me one impossible event and let me recoil from it. It asked me to stand there and compare small wrongness against constant motion until my own judgment started to feel like the unstable variable. The fish moved under the wash spray, through the next guide, toward the cutter lane. As it went, the mouth seemed to settle, just a little. The offset less obvious. Then the fin flattened into a position that made anatomical sense. A second later, the gill plate lay smooth against the body as if it had always belonged there. I stepped closer to the rail, hearing the belt grind under the floor, hearing water slap steel, hearing my own breath inside the hood of my coat. The thing was correcting itself, not twitching from damaged nerves, not being physically reshaped by rollers, adjusting, matching. And I told myself there had to be a simpler answer. Pressure, distortion, a visual trick caused by motion and spray and fatigue. I'd been on my feet since travel. My eyes were dry from salt and cold air. I knew how easy it was to make a machine into a mystery if you stared at it long enough. Then the jam happened, the fish with inward-facing eyes wedged in the narrowing gate. I reached in. Nolan warned me not to remove anything that was correcting itself. The belt released on its own. After that, I couldn't pretend the rules were just insurance language. I radioed Darlene and asked her plain what exactly qualified as correcting itself. Her answer came after a burst of static. "If it resumes pattern alignment without outside help, you leave it alone." Pattern alignment. That was not a phrase anybody used in food processing. And what pattern? The one that matters. Then she clicked off. I wish I could say I stopped asking questions because I was scared. That would be cleaner, easier to explain. The truth was, I kept moving because the line kept moving, and once you're inside a system built on throughput, motion starts to feel like logic. Stop long enough and the whole thing begins leaning on you. So I checked the feeder motor. I tightened a vibration mount. I watched fish pass under bright lights while the taste of metal thickened in my mouth and the floor hummed against my bones. Every now and then I'd catch one with some minute defect, an eye too low, a jawline that dipped wrong, scales running in a whirl instead of a smooth sweep, and every time I waited to see whether it would correct as it went. Most did. That was worse than if none of them had. And if they'd all stayed wrong, I could have called contamination, a bad catch, a processing issue, a poisoned inlet. But correction implied intention. It meant something in the system recognized error and acted on it. I didn't understand what I was looking at yet. A little after 1 in the morning, Nolan sent me to clear a drainage blockage near the rear sorting section. "Grate 7, he said over the radio. "Flow's backing up." The rear section was quieter than the main line, and that made every sound stranger. Less masking noise, more room for detail. The floor there had a thin skin of wash water over it, cold enough to sting through the knees of my coveralls when I crouched. The grate was a long slot drain beneath the sorting table, clogged with scales, tissue, and slush. I got the hook tool and started pulling the mess free, and the smell hit first. Not rot, not sewer gas, something tidal. A deep-water mineral smell under the usual blood and salt, like stones brought up from below the light line. Then came the sound. Somebody said my name, quiet, muffled by metal. So close it might have been directly under my hands. "Elias." I froze with the hook halfway up. You learn voice recognition in industrial spaces the same way you learn machine noise. You build a map of people by timbre, rhythm, breath, the shape of the vowels they use when they're tired. This voice was close to Nolan's. Same dry tone, same flattening on the second syllable. It said my name again, but the timing was off. Like a recording played with tiny errors in the gaps between words. "Elias, hand me the hook." I looked over my shoulder. Nobody there, just stainless steel, spray haze, and the wash line shivering under fluorescent lights. The voice came from the drain, not echoing through it, rising from below it. "Hand me the hook." Then after a pause that was a fraction too long, "Please." My scalp prickled under the cap. The floor felt even colder through one knee. I leaned closer before I could stop myself, hearing water thread through the grate, hearing that deep hum below the machinery, hearing, I realized then, more than one voice beneath the first. Soft overlaps, fragments. Somebody laughing too early, somebody whispering from too far away. "Elias," Nolan said in my earpiece, sharp enough to make me jerk. "Do not answer." I stood so fast my boot slipped. My hand slapped the sorting table to catch myself. The stainless surface was slimy and freezing. "You hearing this?" I asked. "Yeah, I'm hearing channel bleed, and I'm hearing you breathing too fast. Step away from the drain." The voice below changed. Still Nolan's, but thinner now. Stretched. "Don't walk off, I need you down here." I backed up. There are moments when professional habit saves you because it gives you something to do besides panic. I shut the maintenance hatch on the drain service port. I marked the clog half cleared. I stepped 3 paces back because Nolan had said step away and because the rule on the wall had suddenly become the most reasonable sentence I'd ever read. "Source?" I asked, forcing my voice level. "Below the plant," Nolan said. "Not in the lines, not in the walls. Below." That answer should have been impossible. Water, yes, pump noise, structural resonance. But voices don't come up through a drainage system from open ocean and emerge shaped like people you know. The grate behind me gave a soft clink, then another, like fingertips on the underside of metal. I moved farther back. "Who else is on this channel?" "Tonight?" Nolan asked. "Just you, me, Darlene, and what use is our voices when the drains are carrying enough wash?" My mouth went dry, even with the metallic taste still coating it. "You say that like it's normal." Normal and safe aren't the same thing. I wanted to demand more. I wanted to ask what exactly used their voices and how long it had been happening and why anybody in their right mind was still standing inside this building if the plumbing had started talking back. But then the main line surged louder again, and somewhere to my left a belt alarm chirped twice and died, and the ordinary machinery of the plant folded back over the moment like a blanket over a body. I cleared the blockage from above without opening the grate again. The voices faded once the water started moving. That would have been enough for one night in any other place. Enough to break a contract, collect my tools, and wait for dawn by the road. But by then the plant had already done something to my sense of proportion. Small, impossible things kept arriving wrapped in routine. A voice from a drain, a fish correcting itself, a rule that had anticipated both. No single event gave me permission to call the whole world broken. Each one only forced me to widen it a little. By 1:30, I was watching the line with a different set of eyes. That's when I noticed the repetition. At first it looked like familiarity. Fish are fish, similar size, similar color, similar damage from nets and transport. You expect patterns in a catch because catches are patterns. Same migration, same gear, same haul. I knew all that. But one specimen came through with a crescent scrape near the tail and a missing patch of scales over the right flank. 20 minutes later, I saw it again. Same scrape, same missing patch, same tiny opaque spot in the left eye. Not similar, identical. I marked the time on my glove with a pen. Then another came through, one with the lower jaw nicked at the hinge and a dark bruise beneath the gill plate. I'd noticed it earlier because the bruise looked almost thumb-shaped. 30 or 40 fish later, there it was again. I called Darlene. "Rule 5, I said. I'm noticing repetition." "What kind?" "Exact. Same markings, same damage. Same bodies, a hiss of static. Report it and don't intervene. That's the rule. I know the rule. I'm asking what it means." "It means the line is cycling." "Cycling what?" She didn't answer immediately. In the background of her channel, I could hear the wet slap of fish on belt and the high whine of a pressure hose. Then she said, "If you see the same one 3 times, step back from the lane." "Why?" "Because by the 3rd pass, it's not trying to become product anymore." The line went dead. I wish I could tell you I understood that sentence when I heard it. I didn't. I only understood that it landed in the body before it reached the mind. My shoulders tightened. The back of my neck went cold. I watched the fish flow under the lights and felt the whole plant narrow around one question. Trying to become product for what? A few minutes later, I saw the bruised one again. 3rd pass. Same thumb-shaped mark beneath the gill. Same jaw nick. Same dull eye. Except this time, when it moved beneath the spray, the bruise shifted. It thinned and spread into branching lines under the skin. Not random damage anymore, but something like a map, or capillaries, or roots looking for purchase. I stepped back from the rail. The specimen's mouth opened as it passed. Not gasping, forming. I couldn't hear anything over the machinery, but I could see the movement well enough to know it wasn't random. It was shaping syllables. Testing a mouth that had never belonged to speech. The fish rotated slightly as the belt carried it into the cutter lane, and for an instant I saw the inside of its gill chamber. There was tissue there that shouldn't exist, in a pale, folded texture arranged almost like the ridges of an inner ear. Then the blade took it and the body vanished into the next stage of the line. I stood there, breathing through my mouth, trying not to taste the plant, trying not to think about repetition as anything but a process fault. My radio crackled. Nolan said, "How many times?" 3. Did it vocalize? I couldn't hear it. That wasn't the question. I looked down at my gloves. At some point, I'd clenched them hard enough to press crescent marks into the rubber. It moved like it was trying to talk. "Then don't watch the line too long at a stretch. Why does that matter? Because once you start recognizing their attempts, they start recognizing your pattern back. That was the first moment I considered that the rules might not exist to protect workers from accidents, and they might exist to protect workers from being noticed. Not by supervisors, not by regulators, by whatever below the plant was sorting acceptable from unacceptable and using the line to do it. The grinding hum under the floor deepened, or maybe I only started hearing the lower note beneath it. The constant machine vibration that had seemed ordinary at the start of the shift now felt layered, as if the belt motors were harmonizing with something older and much larger buried under all that steel. Looking back, that was the last stretch of time when leaving might still have been simple. The machinery stopped a little after 2 in the morning. Everything doesn't go silent at once in a processing plant. It unwinds. A shriek of belt friction, rollers slowing, water still hissing for a second longer than it should. A cutter thumping to a halt, and then the absence arrives in pieces, the kind you feel more than hear. What remained was the floor. It kept vibrating, not the quick, fine chatter of motors under load. Something slower, deeper, rhythmic. It rose through the soles of my boots and into my calves in pulses, like standing on the chest of some enormous sleeping thing while it dreamed badly. Darlene's voice came over the radio instantly, no hesitation. "Everybody out of processing. Now." I moved toward the exit with my body, but my head kept turning, tracking the sensation. The overhead lights trembled in their housings. A hanging hose tapped the wall in time with the pulses. Somewhere down the line, fish still on the stopped belt gave little wet slides as the vibration shifted them by fractions of an inch. I should have run, and instead I knelt and pressed one gloved hand to the floor. The concrete was cold and damp and alive with motion, not random, not structural settling. There was cadence in it, spacing, a return interval. 3 close pulses, then a longer pause, then one heavy push from below that made the drain water shiver in straight lines toward the center channels. Something was moving beneath us, not across the seabed. Through it. "Elias," Darlene said, closer now, not through the radio but from somewhere behind my left shoulder. "Move." I looked up. She was already at the fire door with one hand on the push bar. Not frightened, not shouting, just fixed on me with an expression I hadn't seen from her before. Not authority, calculation, like she was trying to decide whether I was worth retrieving. "What is that?" I asked. The vibration came again. 3 small, 1 large. The stopped fish on the belt trembled in place. Darlene's answer was quiet enough that I almost missed it under the rattling light fixture. Too close. Then she was through the door and gone. That should have forced me after her. Instead, it pinned me where I was. Because too close to what is not an answer you give unless there is a known thing being measured against a known boundary. Too close meant distance, position, recurrence. It meant somebody here understood the motion below well enough to classify it. I stood and listened. The building had different acoustics with the machines dead. Every drip arrived sharp. Every belt tick on the cooling rollers sounded like bone settling. The drain channels along the floor began making a sucking noise, not from outflow but from pressure changes somewhere below, and water lowered in them by maybe half an inch, exposing strips of black slime along the metal edges. Then I heard it. A voice from the drainage grate nearest the primary line. Darlene's voice. "Elias, don't use the stairs." The real Darlene was outside the processing room. I knew that. I knew it with absolute certainty. The voice beneath the grate repeated itself. Same words, wrong spacing. "Elias, don't use the stairs." More voices joined it, braided together under the floor. Nolan. Darlene. My own voice, faint and thin, though I hadn't heard it from outside myself. The cold in that room changed. It wasn't temperature exactly, it was direction. All at once, I became aware of the fact that every drain, every wash channel, every runoff slot in that plant sloped downward to somewhere I had never seen. The vibration struck again, harder. In a hanging scale on the wall swung 6 inches to one side. One of the access panels along the floor buckled upward and dropped back with a metallic cough. Sub-level C, I thought. I don't know why then. Maybe because once you realize a building has a forbidden level below the working floor and the floor starts acting like skin over muscle. Your mind connects them whether you want it to or not. I went the wrong way on purpose. Not toward the fire door. Toward the service corridor beside the refrigeration bank where I'd seen an old freight lift gate and a warning stencil partly scrubbed off the wall. The air back there smelled even more strongly of salt and iron, and under that there was something sharp and mineral that reminded me of struck stone. Condensation ran down pipes in cold threads. The vibration followed me, weaker in the air, stronger in the handrails. The corridor ended at a steel door with a painted letter C beneath the newer safety signage. The official seal strip across the latch had been broken long ago and never replaced. The door wasn't locked. That was its own kind of message. Never enter sub-level C during night shift operations. Not because you couldn't, because you might. I pulled the door open. Warm air came up first, not hot. Warmer than the plant above, wet and dense and carrying a biological smell that didn't belong to any ordinary process room. Imagine tide pools sealed in a tank with fresh blood and cut kelp in the inside of a living shell. Add the metallic edge that had already been coating my throat all night. That was the smell rising out of sub-level C. The stairs were concrete at the top and something else lower down. My boots stopped ringing halfway through the descent. The sound turned dull and padded, as if a softer layer had grown over the original structure. The walls narrowed. The lighting changed from industrial white to old emergency amber. And in that color, the moisture on the surfaces looked less like condensation and more like sweat. I reached the bottom and understood all at once that I was no longer inside any space designed for workers. Sub-level C had started as a service level. I could still see the bones of it. Old catwalks, corroded railings, retired pumps bolted to platforms above tide height. But the lower half of the chamber had been overtaken by something integrated, patient, and biological. Channels ran through the floor in branching loops, carrying slurries of water, blood, and matter I didn't want to identify, and the channels weren't pipes. They were lined with a pale elastic tissue that flexed in slow peristaltic waves. Ribbed membranes opened and closed over junctions to direct flow. The whole thing occupied the space the way roots occupy broken pavement, by finding every crack and making it theirs. And it was old, not decades old. Older in the way cave systems feel old. Older in the way a thing feels when human construction sits on top of it instead of the other way around. The plant hadn't created this level. It had enclosed it, harnessed it, fed it. Above me, faint through steel and concrete, the stopped belts shuddered. Down here, the vibration answered. I moved to the railing overlooking the central channel and saw malformed specimens dropping through a chute from the processing floor above. Fish I'd seen on the line, and bodies too symmetrical in the wrong way. Bodies that had corrected halfway and failed. They slid into a widening basin where the pale lining of the channel thickened into folds. The folds parted, closed. What came out downstream no longer resembled fish. It looked refined, reduced, redistributed into smooth strands and particulate clouds carried deeper into the structure. Not waste disposal. Selection. That was the third escalation, and it was the one that broke the last ordinary explanation I had left. A row of old inspection windows lined the opposite wall. Behind them, set into the rock itself, I saw vertical shafts running down into black water below the chamber. The organic channels fed those shafts through narrowing valves that puckered open only when the material moving through them had reached a certain consistency. A few thicker fragments were rejected and drawn aside into side pockets where the lining tightened around them until they stopped moving. Only certain forms passed through. The rest were retained, reshaped, or removed. The words came to me not as theory but as recognition. Pattern alignment, acceptable forms, repetition, correction. All of it had been language orbiting this place. A radio hissed behind me. I spun and saw Darlene standing on the landing, one hand on the rail, not surprised to find me there. "You shouldn't have come down," she said. The chamber around us made her voice sound small. "You knew?" I said. "Yes." "What is this?" She came the rest of the way down without hurry. The wet amber light made her look older, more tired, not frightened. Resigned in a way that felt practiced. Shall we call it filtration, because that's the closest word anybody found that didn't make people stupid with panic. "Anybody found?" I asked. "Who wrote the rules?" "I never knew their names." She looked out over the channels instead of at me. "They were here before my time, before the plant had the shape it has now, before radio, before welded steel maybe. Men and women kept records, then shorter records, then rules. Rules survive better." Loop 1 tightened around my throat. Somebody had found this before us, studied it, reduced an impossible world into 6 instructions ordinary workers could follow without understanding why. "What's under there?" I asked. Darlene gave a small shake of her head. "Wrong question." Something moved in the central channel below. Not a fish, too smooth, too pale. It rolled once beneath the surface film, it showing a banded texture like muscle wrapped around stone, then disappeared into one of the deeper shafts. My skin crawled. "The plant feeds it," I said. "The plant stabilizes it." "With fish? With biological pattern?" She said that like I was the one being imprecise. "Marine life's close enough to keep the exchange moving. Most nights." "Most nights." I turned to her. "And the nights it isn't?" She didn't answer. Instead, she walked to a side chute where one malformed specimen had snagged against a guide rib. It was one I recognized from the line above, the repeated one with the bruised gill mark. It writhed weakly in place, mouth opening and closing in those almost formed shapes. Darlene put one gloved hand on the railing, then with the other reached into the moving side channel. My whole body flinched. The fish pressed against her palm, not bit, pressed, like it recognized contact, like it was checking the boundary of her skin. She let it do that for 2 full seconds, then lifted her hand away unharmed, and the specimen slipped free into the basin below. "I told you not to freelance," she said. That was the foil reveal, though I didn't have language for it then. Darlene wasn't brave, she wasn't reckless. She was in negotiation with the system and had been for a long time. "What the hell was that?" I asked. "Proof," she said. "It knows the difference between interference and permission. How do you know it won't take more than permission one night?" Her face changed at that. Just slightly. Not fear. Weariness. "I don't." A pulse rolled through the chamber, stronger than before. The membranes along the channels cinched tight. Far below, something in the black shafts answered with a rising pressure wave that made the surface bulge. Darlene finally looked at me fully. "If the floor vibrates while the machinery is dead, it means the exchange below is still active without cover from the line above. That's when it notices gaps. That's when it starts using whatever pattern is nearest." I understood then why the voices came through the drains, why repetition mattered, why malformed specimens tried to correct themselves on the belt. The system wasn't just processing fish, it was evaluating forms, searching for acceptable arrangements, testing patterns against some deeper criterion that had nothing to do with food. And we had been standing above it all night, feeding it. The maximum revelation didn't arrive as one dramatic insight, when it assembled itself at speed while I stared at those channels. The plant wasn't a workplace with a secret under it. It was a containment structure built around an ancient process in the seabed, a process older than the facility, older than the industry, maybe older than the settlement itself. The belts above weren't about production. Production was camouflage, human commerce wrapped around a deeper necessity. Fish came in by the ton because marine flesh gave the system material to read, refine, and pass downward in patterns it accepted. Malformed specimens weren't contamination. They were failed attempts at alignment. Repetition wasn't coincidence. It was cycling. The same biological information run through again until it matched or proved unusable. The drainage voices were leakage, imitation rising through every channel that connected the plant to what lay below. And the rules existed because people before us had learned exactly how little ordinary workers needed to know in order not to interrupt the exchange. Do not stop the conveyor belts unless instructed by a supervisor because the flow had to remain continuous. If a specimen appears malformed, do not discard it because rejection was part of the system's work, not ours. If the floor begins to vibrate without machinery active, leave immediately, because the thing below has begun operating without enough feed to distract it. Do not respond to voices from the drainage system, because response creates pattern confirmation. If you notice repetition in specimens, report it, but do not intervene because the cycle is trying to solve something. You never enter sub-level C during night shift operations, because if you see the system directly, you might understand it too well, or it might understand you. I said some of that out loud, not all. Just enough that I heard how insane it sounded in my own voice and couldn't find a weaker version that fit the evidence. Darlene didn't correct me. "That's close enough," she said. "What is it filtering for?" That was loop 2, sitting in the center of everything. The deep question beneath every practical one. Her gaze went to the shafts in the rock. Not for, against. The chamber trembled. Then every radio channel in the building opened at once. Static burst around us, then Nolan's voice flattened by too many speakers. "Darlene, we've lost return flow from upper drain banks. Main line can't restart. It's pulling from the wrong side." Wrong side. In beneath the nearest membrane, something pushed upward hard enough to show shape. Not a body. A contour. Long. Segmented or jointed or simply not built for the anatomy I expected. It withdrew before I could map it. Darlene grabbed my sleeve. "We have to restore feed or seal the diverts." "How?" "Upstairs. Manual restart. You just said it notices gaps." "It already has." We ran. The stairs felt steeper going up. The air got colder in layers, each landing stripping some of the wet biological heat away and replacing it with the hard processing chill above. By the time we hit the main floor, the plant sounded wrong in every direction. Some belts still idled, others were dead. Drain channels slurped backward. Overhead, the loudspeaker emitted little pops as if somebody were breathing into the system from far too close. Nolan's voice came again, this time from the wall speaker nearest the line. "Do not let it complete the transfer." Then half a beat later from the floor drains. "Do not let it complete the transfer." The mimic was learning cadence. We hit the primary control bank. Darlene yanked the service panel open and exposed a row of manual overrides. I dropped beside her and started tracing circuits by flashlight because the indicator lights were lying, showing closed loops where there shouldn't have been continuity. The panel door was wet under my forearm, not condensation, slicker than that. A clear film with the same resistant feel I'd noticed on the malformed fish. Contamination had crossed from sensation to surface. Which line feeds the main chute? I asked. Primary conveyor through sorter 3. That feeder motor's already weak. Then make it hold. Easy thing to say. I forced the bypass closed, manually reset the thermal, and shoved the relay with the insulated tool until it seated. The belt started with a wrenching metallic shriek. Fish lurched forward on the line, bodies slapping against guides and rollers. The whole plant seemed to inhale. For 1 second, the floor vibration eased. Then I looked at the moving belt and realized something had changed in me. The fish passing under the lights looked normal. All of them. I knew rationally that they weren't. I'd seen too much. But the subtle wrongness I'd been cataloging all night had become harder to catch. My eyes slid past it. My brain smoothed it over. Mouths that should have looked off-center now read as ordinary. Fins that sat too high seemed acceptable after a second glance. The repetition I'd been tracking dissolved into sameness. My stomach dropped. "Darlene," I said carefully, because saying it carefully was the only way not to lose control. "I can't tell anymore." She didn't ask what I meant. That told me she'd been expecting this. "How long have you been down there?" she asked. "Maybe 10 minutes. Long enough? What's happening to me?" "The system uses exposure both ways," she said, still working the controls. "You watch it long enough, it starts teaching you its tolerances." That was contamination. Not slime on skin, not blood in water. A perceptual infection. The longer you stayed near the filtration process, the more your own recognition of anomaly got adjusted toward its standards. But I remembered Nolan saying once I recognized their attempts, they'd recognize my pattern back. I remembered the metallic taste that never left the throat. I remembered my own voice from the drains. Loop 3 opened wide then, far wider than before. Worker or evaluation subject, operator or specimen. I could no longer tell which side of the system I occupied. The loudspeaker snapped on. "Elias," Nolan said, "check the return tray." I turned. A fish lay crosswise in the return tray where no fish should have been. Same crescent scrape near the tail. Same missing patch of scales over the right flank. The repeated specimen again. It lifted its head and looked at me. Not with the inward-facing eyes from earlier. Worse than that, the eyes were correct now. Humanly focused in the way they fixed on me. The mouth opened once. This time I heard it. Here, not through air. Through the metal under my hands. My own voice vibrating up the control panel. "Still close enough." I hit the tray with the insulated tool so hard the fish flipped back onto the moving line. It vanished under the spray and into the cutters before I could decide whether I'd made the right choice. Darlene grabbed my shoulder. "Don't let it isolate a pattern. Keep the line mixed." "How?" "More feed, faster." That's the kind of instruction only makes sense if you've already accepted the impossible. We pushed the primary line above safe speed. Fish flooded the sorters. Rollers screamed. Water sprayed so hard it misted into my face, cold and bloody and salt sharp. The plant's ordinary sounds swelled until there was almost no room left for the quieter ones below. Almost, but not none. Because under the roar, and the floor kept answering in pulses, and once you've learned to hear that lower rhythm, you never stop. Nolan called out drain bank pressures over the radio. Darlene fed me switch positions and override sequences. We weren't reflecting anymore. We were running, processing, and surviving at the same time, exactly as the structure of the night demanded. Every decision narrowed to motion. Keep it moving. Don't answer. Don't isolate the repeated ones. Don't look too long at anything that's trying to match you back. At some point, a drain grate near the control bank rang with a cluster of taps, then a scraping sound, then words, not mimicry now, not stolen voices. Something down there had found a way to speak without us. The words were wet and difficult, as if forced through tissue not built for language. Acceptable. Darlene went white around the eyes. What does that mean? I shouted. She didn't answer immediately, and that silence frightened me more than the voice. Finally, she said, "It means it's finished comparing." Comparing what? Her grip tightened on the rail until the glove squeaked. You. There are moments fear arrives clean without panic because the fact is too large for panic to hold. I understood then that my night at the plant had not simply exposed me to a hidden system. It had placed me inside its criteria. The rules weren't only about preventing interference, they were also about controlling what kind of human pattern the system got to study. Workers who followed the rules remained noise at the edges. Workers who broke them became legible. I'd entered sub-level C. I'd listened at the drains. I'd watched repeated specimens through multiple cycles. I'd let the system learn my thresholds, and now it had an opinion. "Can it come up?" I asked. Nolan answered before Darlene could. "Not all the way, not if the diverts hold. Not all the way isn't good enough." "No," Nolan said, "it isn't." The floor slammed upward once, hard enough to throw me against the panel. Overhead, one fluorescent tube burst and showered the belt with hot glass. The line kept moving. It had to. Darlene made a decision then. I saw it in the way her shoulders settled. "Keep the primary feed engaged," she said to me. "Where are you going?" "Sub-level C." "No. If the divert membranes lock open, the line won't matter." "You said never enter." "That rule's for people who can still leave clean." That was the bargaining veteran in one sentence. She had been making trades with the system for years, surrendering small pieces of safety, certainty, maybe herself, to keep the larger exchange stable. And now she was about to go make one more. "I'll go," I said. She shook her head. "You don't know the timing." "You do?" "I know enough to make it think I came willingly." I didn't like what that implied. I liked even less how calmly she said it. Nolan's voice cut through with static around the edges. Pressure spike in lower shafts. "Darlene, if you're doing it, do it now." She started for the service corridor, then she stopped and looked back at me. "For what it's worth," she said, "I think it was still deciding." That sentence has lived in me like a splinter. Still deciding. In as if there remained some version of events where I left as just a contractor with a bad story and not whatever I am now. She disappeared down the corridor before I could follow. A second later, Nolan locked the service door remotely. I heard the magnetic clamp engage. I cursed him over the radio. "You were going to go after her," he said. "Yes. She told me not to let you." "What exactly is she doing?" A pause, then, "Balancing the count." That answer sickened me because I almost understood it. The line strained under the increased load. My hands moved without needing the rest of me, checking pressure, forcing relays, clearing the tray when non-repeated fish built up too high. I avoided looking directly at any one specimen for more than a second. The trick by then was not to trust perception. Motion itself became the objective. Keep matter flowing. Deny the system stillness. Deny it a stable human pattern to lock onto. Below the floor, the pulses accelerated. The drains started whispering again, but the words no longer came in familiar voices. They came in versions of sound that hadn't fully decided whether they were language or current. Every few seconds, one resolved long enough for me to hear a fragment. Near, open, accepted. The metallic taste in my mouth had become something else, not blood. Mineral and bitter, like sucking on a coin pulled from deep water. My vision kept snagging on repeating shapes that didn't belong to the plant. 3 fish in a row with the same arc to the spine. 5 bolts on a panel arranged like the bruise pattern beneath that repeated gill. Drain slots that looked momentarily like rows of closed teeth. And that was how I knew contamination had deepened. It wasn't only that anomalies looked normal. Normal things were starting to present as candidates for pattern. At the time, I assumed I was near shock. I know what it actually was now. The floor vibration stopped, not eased, stopped. The sudden absence hit harder than the motion had. The plant kept roaring around me, belts running, water spraying, motors grinding, but the lower pulse was gone. Every drain along the processing room let out the same final sigh, as if pressure below it dropped all at once. Then Nolan said very quietly over the radio, "Manual seals are taking." I sagged against the control panel so hard my knees almost gave out. "Darlene?" No answer. "Nolan, Darlene?" Static. Then, "In sublevel C is no longer on camera." "What does that mean?" "It means the lenses are fouled." He hesitated. "Or covered from the other side." I stared at the service corridor door. The line kept moving. That was the cruel part. Everything above had returned to function. Fish passed under white lights and silver floods, water hissed, rollers turned. On the surface, the plant had gone back to being a workplace. Only now I knew what that workplace actually did. I wanted to shut it all down anyway. Every belt, every pump, every conveyor in the building. Then I remembered the first rule. Do not stop the conveyor belts unless instructed by a supervisor. There was no supervisor left to instruct me, and I finally understood why the rule had been written that way. Not as a command of obedience, but as a transfer of responsibility. As long as somebody in authority existed to tell you to stop, the system could remain human-managed. If no one could safely give that order, then stopping became the far more dangerous choice. Nolan told me to hold speed until dawn, so I did. Those last hours moved strangely, fast in action, endless in feeling. I worked the line alone while the windows slowly leaked gray around their edges. The plant air never warmed. The blood salt smell never thinned. Every surface remained slick and cold. A few times I thought I saw the repeated specimen again, but by then I couldn't trust whether it truly returned or whether my altered perception had started imposing its shape on any fish with a similar mark. Once, near 4 in the morning, the loudspeaker clicked on and I heard Darlene breathing. I didn't answer. After a moment, the speaker went dead. Just before dawn, Nolan came out of the radio room for the first time and joined me on the floor. He looked smaller in person, more worn down, as if whatever he'd been hearing all night had been taking pieces off him through the headset. We didn't shake hands. His gloves were wet, mine were too. He checked the line, checked the drain levels, then looked toward the sealed service corridor. "We keep day shift out of C," he said. "Is she dead?" He didn't say yes. He didn't say no. "That's not how it works down there," he said, which was worse. By 6 in the morning, the first gray daylight had flattened the windows into sheets of pearl. Outside, the harbor would have been waking. Gulls, diesel engines, forklifts, a world still willing to pretend this building existed for commerce alone. Nolan signed my release papers in the break room because Darlene obviously couldn't. The laminated rules still hung beside the clock, clean and bolted in place. I stood there staring at them while the vending machine rattled softly and the coffee on the warmer burned itself into bitterness. "Who replaces them?" I asked. He knew what I meant. "The rules?" He nodded once. "When they have to be changed." "They don't get changed often," he said, "but somebody writes them." He looked at me the way a man looks at weather he's learned not to predict. If you stay long enough, you stop asking whether the first people discovered the system or whether the system arranged for the first people to describe it. That answer did nothing good to my mind. I left anyway. Outside, our dawn over Unalaska had that thin, exhausted brightness that never feels fully warm. The wind off the water hit my face and carried clean salt, harbor fuel, kelp, and gull stink. But underneath all of it, the metallic taste remained lodged in my throat like residue from a swallowed battery. My truck door handle was slick with frost. I rubbed my thumb against it, and for one ugly second, the texture felt exactly like the skin of the malformed fish before it corrected itself. I drove away from the plant with my tools in the back and my contract technically completed. That's the bittersweet part, if you can call it that. I got out. I'm still here. The system didn't pull me fully beneath it. Whatever Darlene did in sublevel C, and it bought enough stability for Dawn to arrive with the building still standing and the thing below still contained under feed and concrete and habit. But victory isn't the same thing as freedom. I never went back to that plant. I refused every offer that came through the dispatcher after that, no matter the rate. I stopped taking overnight industrial jobs anywhere near the coast for almost a year. Even now, I avoid processing floors if I can help it. If I can't, I keep my eyes moving, and I never watch the same product stream too long. Not fish, not meat, not anything passing in quantity beneath bright lights. Because patterns do something to me now. Rows of cans on a grocery shelf. Parked cars with matching dents. Apartment windows lit in repeating grids. If I look long enough, some part of my mind starts trying to decide whether the repetition is natural or corrective, whether I'm observing a pattern or being offered one. Sometimes ordinary asymmetry feels wrong. Sometimes obvious wrongness passes cleanly through my attention, and only returns later when I'm lying awake, tasting metal and trying to reconstruct what I missed. That's how I know the contamination never fully left. And there's one habit I picked up after Alaska that I've never been able to explain to anybody. Whenever I walk into a building with floor drains, I listen before I speak. Not because I expect to hear a voice every time. Because once, in a place built over something older than industry and more patient than any of us, I learned there are systems that don't care who you are until you answer back. And I still can't tell whether I survived that night as Elias Rourke, or whether some part of me was accepted and sent on ahead.